Have you ever noticed that sometimes the people who hurt you the deepest don't arrive with a storm? They arrive with a smile. They come bearing warmth, an old family photo, a memory from simpler days. They ask how you've been, right after quietly draining the last ounce of your peace. They say, "I love you," seconds before stepping over your boundaries one more time, and perhaps without realizing it, you let it slide. Not because you're weak, not because you lack courage, but because somewhere along the way, you were taught to mistake love for endurance. But here's a Stoic truth we don't hear often enough. Being a good person does not mean becoming a doormat. And unconditional love? It was never meant to translate into unconditional tolerance. There are certain behaviors that cross a line no matter who they come from, whether it's your partner, your boss, or even the people who share your blood. In this video, we'll explore 5 very specific behaviors you should never tolerate from anyone. Not because you're cruel, not because you're ungrateful, but because self-respect is not a privilege. It's a responsibility. As the philosopher Epictetus once said, "You are not harmed by what others do. You are harmed when you allow it to continue." So if you've ever left a conversation feeling like you've shrunk just a little, like you're slowly vanishing from your own story, this video is for you. And it's time we start with the most subtle, most familiar weapon of them all. Criticism disguised as concern. It rarely starts with a scream. It begins with a sigh. "Why do you always do it that way? That shirt again? Are you sure that's a good idea?" One offhand remark today, another tomorrow, a quiet jab next week, until one day you realize you're hesitating before speaking. You're second-guessing your words before they leave your mouth. Not because you've become unsure of yourself, but because someone, somewhere, has trained you to believe that you are always, in some small, invisible way, wrong. That, my friends, is not feedback. It's erosion. There's a difference between guidance and control. Constructive feedback sharpens you. It's kind, clear, and rooted in a sincere desire to see you grow. Constant criticism, on the other hand, is vague, relentless, and often aimed not at your actions, but at your very character. You can hear it in the tone. You can feel it in the pit of your stomach. It doesn't build you up. It chips away at you, piece by piece. In families, it comes dressed as comparison. Your cousin already bought a house. Your sister never talks back. In relationships, it hides behind sarcasm. "Relax, I'm just being honest." "Wow, you're so sensitive." And in the workplace, it wraps itself in the cloak of perfectionism. "Good job, but next time, maybe don't. I wish you were more like..." And here's where the real danger lies. The more familiar it becomes, the easier it is to normalize. You stop noticing the ache in your chest. You stop fighting the silence. And eventually, you begin to edit yourself, trimming away pieces of your voice just to stay afloat in the relationship. But Stoicism teaches a hard, necessary lesson. What you allow, you teach. And if you permit someone to erode your dignity, even in small doses, day after day, you silently hand them the permission to continue. Epictetus reminds us again, no one can harm you without your consent. Criticism that attacks your worth isn't a lesson. It's a form of subtle domination. It's a slow, invisible hand tightening around your voice. So how do you respond? How do you reclaim your space in a world that often mistakes kindness for compliance? You start by recognizing the signs. That knot in your chest, the exhaustion after a simple conversation, the slight droop in your shoulders. These aren't overreactions. They're warning signals. Your soul has been whispering for a long time that something feels wrong. And here's a truth you need to carry. You don't owe anyone a dramatic explanation. You don't need to shout. You don't need to win the argument. What you need is a line. A calm, clear, unshakable line drawn with quiet conviction. Because the longer you tolerate constant erosion, the further you drift from your own voice. And if you don't defend your inner world, no one else will. So stay with me. This isn't the last behavior we need to talk about. In the next segment, we'll uncover another silent weapon people use to control you without ever raising their voice, and how Stoicism arms you to deal with it. And when you lose that inner compass, that quiet, steady voice inside you, you begin to lose your sense of direction in life. It's a slow erosion, not a sudden collapse. That's why it's so important to remember. Endurance is not wisdom, and politeness is not peace. Too many of us have been conditioned to believe that suffering in silence somehow makes us noble. But sometimes, real healing begins with a sentence, as simple and honest as this. That felt like criticism, not care. Say it once, say it calmly. Then step back, watch carefully. See who chooses to meet you with respect, and who only ever knew how to relate to you through control. You'll be surprised, or maybe you won't, by who stays and who gets uncomfortable the moment you draw a line. And it never begins with some grand, unforgivable offense. No, it always starts small. A late-night phone call you didn't ask for. An unsolicited opinion about your life choices. Someone borrowing your time, your space, your energy, without so much as a thought to ask first. You brush it off because it seems minor, harmless. You tell yourself, it's not a big deal. But somewhere deep down, you feel that subtle shift. Something inside you whispers, this isn't okay. And yet, you silence that voice. Why? Because it's your mother. Because it's your brother. Because it's someone who says, I love you. But here's a truth worth remembering. Love without respect isn't love. It's possession. If someone continuously refuses to honor your boundaries, they're not loving you. They're managing you. I remember hearing the story of a man whose mother would show up at his house unannounced every week. She had a spare key. She'd stroll in without warning, rearrange his living room, comment on the groceries in his fridge, even open his mail. When he finally gathered the courage to ask her to call before visiting, she laughed and said, I'm your mother. I don't need permission. That sentence stayed with him, not because it was shouted, but because it quietly revealed everything. It told him exactly how she saw him, not as a separate sovereign human being, but as an extension of herself, a possession she could enter, control, and rearrange at will. And this is how boundary violations often look in real life. Not through blatant acts of disrespect, but through small, persistent patterns that quietly whisper, what matters to you doesn't matter to me. And the longer you tolerate it, the easier it is to forget that your time, your space, your mental peace, they belong to you. They always have. Some people cross your boundaries because no one ever taught them what a boundary was. They grew up in families where love meant unrestricted access, where privacy was seen as rejection, and where closeness was confused with control. But others? Others know exactly what they're doing. They don't storm through your defenses. They test them. They lean in just far enough. They apologize just enough. They twist your empathy into guilt, until you stop saying no, until you become a yes machine. And when you finally gather the strength to say no, when you finally stand your ground, they'll look at you and say, "Wow, you've changed." But what they really mean is, "You stopped letting me control you." Stoicism reminds us that boundaries are not about building walls to keep people out. They're about protecting what's worth keeping close: your peace, your clarity, your sense of self. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." But I would add, it's also dyed by the people you allow unfiltered access to your life. So, what do you do when someone crosses that invisible line? You don't beg them to value you. You don't explain your worth. Instead, you calmly clarify your standard. You say, "Please don't stop by without calling," or "I'm not comfortable with that topic," or simply, "I'm not available right now." Simple, direct, no apologies, no long explanations. And then comes the hardest, most important part: follow through. Because boundaries without consequences, they're nothing but empty suggestions. If someone continues to ignore the line you've drawn, you don't owe them another warning. You owe yourself action. Limit the time you give them. Shift the way you engage, and if necessary, walk away entirely. Stoic strength isn't about building cold, impenetrable walls. It's about drawing clear, steady lines with quiet conviction, and having the discipline to stand by them. Because the moment you stop treating your boundaries as optional, you begin to teach others how to love you not through guilt, not through obligation, but through honest, mutual respect. And here's the thing: some wounds don't bleed. They don't leave bruises or marks you can point to, but they linger in the way you second-guess your own memories, in the way you hesitate before sharing your feelings, in the way you start your sentences with, "Maybe I'm just being too sensitive," even though deep down you know you're not. And that's exactly how it begins: small, quiet, and almost invisible. In the previous part, we explored how boundary violations chip away at your sense of self. But when it comes to manipulation, there's one tactic even more insidious than overstepping lines: gaslighting. Gaslighting is among the most dangerous forms of manipulation because it doesn't attack you from the outside. No, it dismantles you from within. It creeps in like a slow poison, eroding your confidence, distorting your sense of reality, and making you doubt the one thing you should be able to rely on: your own mind. It usually starts subtly, with small contradictions, a dismissive, "I never said that," or a cold, "You're imagining things," and of course the classic, "Don't be so dramatic." At first, you might walk away from these conversations feeling strangely unsettled, like you lost a battle you didn't even realize you were fighting. You sense that something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And over time, those little moments add up. You begin to question yourself. You start to wonder, was I really wrong? Am I just too sensitive? Maybe I overreacted. Maybe the problem is me. But hear this clearly. It's not you. You're not overreacting. You're being manipulated. Gaslighting is not a misunderstanding. It's not a simple disagreement or an honest mistake. It's a strategy, a deliberate, calculated effort to turn your clarity into confusion, your self-assurance into hesitation, and your voice into silence. The person who gaslights you doesn't want connection. They don't seek understanding. What they crave is control. They win not when you confront them, but when you begin keeping score against yourself. They win when your truth becomes something you second-guess, when your own reality turns into a courtroom where they sit as judge and jury. But here's a timeless Stoic truth you must hold on to. Your mind is a fortress. No one, no matter how charming, how familiar, or how subtly manipulative, has the right to invade it without your permission. Epictetus once said, "If someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation." Now, this doesn't mean you're to blame for the abuse. Not at all. It means your power begins the moment you recognize what's happening and refuse to let them define your reality. So what can you do? How do you fight back without losing yourself? In the battle? The answer is deceptively simple. You stop debating. Gaslighters aren't interested in truth. They're not seeking understanding. What they want is dominance. And the more you argue, the more you feed the dynamic. Instead, observe. Become a quiet witness to their tactics. Write things down, their words, your reactions, the patterns you notice. Not for revenge, not to weaponize later, but for yourself, for clarity. Talk to someone you trust, someone outside the manipulation, someone who will look you in the eye and say, "No, you're not crazy. That really happened." That moment, when your memory is confirmed, when your reality is validated, is when healing begins. And finally, set a line. Not a threat, not a dramatic speech, a boundary with clear, quiet consequences. If the pattern repeats, you don't need to yell. You don't need to beg. You simply step back, detach, reclaim your mind piece by piece. Because here's the thing. Gaslighting doesn't steal your power in one violent sweep. It takes it inch by inch, one moment at a time, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize who's staring back. But today, you see it, you feel it, and from this moment forward, you refuse to betray your own mind just to make someone else comfortable. This isn't weakness, this is wisdom. It's the kind of quiet strength the Stoics spoke of, a resolve forged not in anger, but in clarity. There's a moment, and if it's happened to you, you'll never forget it. The moment when someone looks you dead in the eye and lies to your face. Not a careless slip, not a harmless white lie, but a calculated distortion of the truth. And something inside you fractures. It's not just your trust in them that breaks, it's your trust in yourself. You think, if they can lie so easily, what else have I missed? Was any of it ever real? And here's the cruel truth about dishonesty. It rarely arrives as one enormous betrayal. It's more clever than that. It comes in drops, a skipped detail. Here, a story that subtly shifts there, a promise forgotten. Again, and you, wanting to believe, give them the benefit of the doubt, until you start collecting red flags like souvenirs. Until one day you look around and realize you've been building your relationship on shifting sand, and that's when you remember your peace, your clarity, your inner fortress. They belong to you, and no one, no matter how close, has the right to take that away. And this is precisely where Stoicism draws a clear, unmistakable line. In a world so often clouded by half-truths and convenient illusions, the Stoics remind us what matters most. Seneca once wrote, "Truth is the first lesson of friendship, because without truth, there is no relationship, only performance, only illusion." Think about that for a moment. Without truth, what do you actually have? A bond built on fiction? A stage play where both people pretend to care while quietly keeping score? People often claim they lie to protect your feelings. But let's be honest, what they're really protecting is their own convenience. They're shielding themselves from discomfort, from accountability, from the risk of tarnishing the polished image they've spent so long carefully selling you. And the cost? Your clarity, your peace. Let's be clear about something else, too. Dishonesty isn't always loud or obvious. It comes in many disguises. There's omission, what they carefully choose not to say. There's minimization. It's not a big deal. There's deflection. Why are you always so paranoid? And perhaps most insidious of all, there's betrayal wrapped in kindness, where someone says the right things, performs the right gestures, while quietly undermining you behind your back. The effect is always the same. Over time, you start losing your footing. The ground beneath your feet, once solid, begins to feel unstable. You catch yourself second-guessing your own memory. And perhaps worst of all, you stop trusting your own judgment. That isn't just emotional, it's biological. Neuroscience has shown that repeated exposure to deception doesn't just hurt your heart, it weakens your brain's confidence in its own perception of reality. It literally rewires you, and let's call this what it is. That's not love, that's sabotage. So the question is, what does a Stoic do when faced with dishonesty? How do you reclaim your footing in a world where words can be weapons and truth is treated like currency to be spent only when convenient? First, stop listening to words. Start watching behavior. Because people can lie with words, but truth has a funny way of leaking through actions. It shows up in what they do when no one's watching, in how they treat you when there's nothing to gain. Second, stop trying to fix them. Their dishonesty isn't your burden to carry. You don't need another heart-to-heart. You don't need another promise. What you need is a decision, not for them, for you. Third, reclaim your clarity. Write down the contradictions you notice. Anchor yourself to your version of events, and then allow the silence between you to grow, not from anger, but from respect for your own peace. Because here's a harsh, liberating truth. When someone repeatedly lies to you, what they're really telling you, without even saying a word, is that your trust is disposable, that your peace is negotiable, that your clarity is optional, and your response must be final, not anymore. And the erosion of respect doesn't always start with a blatant insult. Sometimes it starts small, a smirk, a jab disguised as a joke, a comment dressed up as teasing. Maybe you laugh along or force a grin, but something tightens in your chest. Some ancient part of you recognizes the sting hiding in the humor. Because disrespect disguised as humor is one of the most socially accepted yet quietly destructive forms of emotional abuse. It doesn't roar, it snickers. It hides its blade behind a punchline. And when you flinch, they say you're too sensitive. Sound familiar? You're not overreacting. You're being baited. I remember a woman once said, "It wasn't the insult that finally broke me. It was realizing I had spent 20 years laughing at my own humiliation just to keep the peace." Let that sink in. How many laughs, how many shrugged-off comments have you quietly swallowed just to avoid the storm? The truth is, people who hide cruelty behind humor know exactly what they're doing. They study your insecurities. They learn which buttons to press, then craft their jokes to hit those exact spots. And when you react, they cloak themselves in faux innocence. "Come on, I was just being honest." Or, "If you can't take a joke, maybe you're the problem." But let's ask an honest question. If the joke only ever lands one way, if the only person laughing is the one holding the knife, is that humor? Or is it domination wearing a mask? The Stoics had a very different idea of how words should be used. Marcus Aurelius said, "Let your words be few and well chosen, like a physician's knife, used to heal, not to wound. Words should uplift, clarify, and strengthen, not mock, not diminish." So let's be clear. Brutal honesty isn't a virtue. It's often a cover for emotional laziness. Real honesty is courageous, but it's also kind. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't chip away at your confidence for the sake of a cheap laugh. It builds, even when it's uncomfortable. So how should you respond when the joke cuts deeper than it should? You don't need to argue. You don't need to explain. You don't need to rehearse a clever comeback. You simply stop laughing. You stop validating cruelty with your silence, and you say, calmly, firmly, "That felt disrespectful," because it's not about winning the conversation, it's about reclaiming your peace. We ended the last part by reclaiming our voice, by refusing to laugh at the jokes meant to wound us. And now it's time to let the discomfort land exactly where it belongs, with them. Because here's the unshakable truth, one the Stoics made clear centuries ago. You do not owe anyone your tolerance for disrespect, not a stranger, not a friend, and especially not family. In fact, when harm comes disguised as care, cloaked in familiar faces and old memories, it becomes even more important to hold the line. If someone consistently hides poison inside their punchlines, you are under no obligation to sip it quietly just to keep the room peaceful. That's not virtue. That's self-betrayal. And let's be clear, you are not too sensitive. You are not the difficult one. You're not the one making things uncomfortable. You are the one who has finally had enough. And contrary to what some may say, that is not weakness. That is strength disguised as dignity. It's courage dressed in calm. It's wisdom wrapped in silence. You've just walked with me through 5 insidious behaviors that can quietly dismantle your spirit over time. Relentless criticism, the erosion of your boundaries, subtle emotional manipulation, chronic dishonesty, and disrespect disguised as humor. None of these leave visible bruises, but all of them leave damage. Slow, unseen, but deeply felt. And the most dangerous part? These wounds often come from the hands we trusted most. A partner who claims to love you while quietly corroding your sense of worth. A family member who masters the weaponization of guilt, calling it concern. A friend who treats your silence not as peace, but as permission to keep stepping over your boundaries. It's a quiet kind of violence, and it thrives in the spaces we refuse to claim. But here's the hardest truth to hear, and it's one that Stoicism dares us to face without flinching. What you tolerate, you teach. Every time you swallow your voice, every time you laugh it off, every time you choose a fragile peace over your own dignity, you're teaching them that your boundaries are negotiable, that your peace is for sale, that your discomfort is a price you're willing to pay for their comfort. And it's not because you're weak. It's because you forgot you have a choice, but not anymore, because now you know better. And Stoicism isn't about enduring everything. It's not about becoming a cold stone, unaffected and detached from the world. It isn't about pretending that words can't hurt or that betrayal doesn't sting. It's about clarity. It's about agency. It's about knowing, with quiet certainty, where your peace ends and someone else's chaos begins, and refusing to let them overlap. Marcus Aurelius never told us to suffer fools endlessly. He didn't advise us to become martyrs in our own homes or relationships. He taught us to see people and situations as they are, not as we wish them to be, and to act accordingly. That means you get to choose who has access to your mind, your time, your energy, and your spirit. Who gets a seat at your table, and who, by their own repeated actions, has forfeited the right to speak into your life. You don't need anyone's permission to protect your peace. You don't need a round-table discussion or a vote. What you need is courage. The courage to start small, with one honest line. One truth you've been carrying in silence for far too long. Maybe it's saying, plainly, I don't find that funny anymore. Or, that's not okay with me. Maybe it's deciding in this moment that silence is no longer your survival strategy, but the sound of your self-respect finally waking up. Whatever it is, let it be real. Let it be yours. Because when you stop tolerating what quietly wounds you, you start building a life that quietly honors you. And in that sacred space, you won't just endure, you'll rise. If this video struck a chord with you, I invite you to leave a comment below. Share your story. Someone out there needs to know they aren't alone in this. And if you felt seen today, if these words felt like they were written with you in mind, give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Stoic Scrolls for more insights that guard your peace, sharpen your perception, and steady your soul. Remember, this journey isn't about becoming harder. It's about becoming wiser. Because you were never meant to be everyone's emotional punching bag. You were meant to stand tall, to speak truth, and to draw your boundaries with calm, with love, and with quiet, unshakable power.